Stephenson'S link valve timing on a small locomotive, part 1. Identifying the type of valve gear fitted to your miniature steam locomotive and having a look at the design and accessibility of two popular types. The valve gear that you're currently looking at is not Stephenson'S link valve gear. This is Valshart's. And just in case you find my accent and pronunciation a little difficult, I'll put the spelling on screen. During development of the steam engine, there were many different kinds of valve gear. Some good, some not so good. Some simple, some extremely complicated. This one is Valshart's valve gear. And the good thing about this valve gear is all of it is external, so you can work on it without turning the engine upside down or on its side. On a miniature steam locomotive, Stephenson'S link valve gear, which is entirely different to this, is very difficult to work on owing to the confined spaces. The part that the valve gears have in common is the expansion link. This engine is a 5-inch gauge Great Western Railway Manor class locomotive, and this uses a version of Stephenson'S link motion. Also in 5-inch gauge, here is my Stirling single, which uses Stephenson'S link motion, and again all the moving parts apart from the connecting rod, the piston and the crosshead are internal, which makes them very difficult to work on. Even on the full size they were difficult to work on, and it's obvious that this was a problem. As British steam locomotives evolved into the final phase before they were scrapped, the standard class of British Railways locomotive had quite accessible valve gear, all external. Quite unlike this one, it's a Great Western Railway 14XX class, and as you can see, to oil it I have to put a long pipe on the end of my oil can. Recently I've been getting quite a lot of questions from viewers asking me to show how to set the valve gear on a locomotive. Valshart's valve gear and Stephenson'S link work very differently. In this next clip I'm going to show you underneath this engine so you can get a good look at how it's put together. This is the crank axle and the valve gear underneath the engine, and as you can see it looks quite well made. There's a little bit of side rattle, but that's not a big problem. When I put a screwdriver in between those two parts that are moving in the centre, they stop moving. This is an ideal opportunity to put some more oil into the works. It's worth remembering that in and amongst all these mechanical moving parts there is an axle pump. And axle pumps can have an effect on the smoothness of running of a locomotive. Frequently owners remove axle pumps from the engine just to make them run more smoothly, because on the pump stroke there's considerable resistance, so the engine goes up and down the track unevenly. But as most of the time this is going to sit on my sideboard, I'm not going to remove the axle pump, I'll leave it just as it is. Here's a close-up of the crank axle. And oh shock horror, the crank webs appear to be secured to the crankshaft and the crank pins using grub screws. But upon closer inspection I can see that the crank webs are welded to the crankshaft, which makes for a much stronger crank axle. When you build a model of one of these things, rather than buy it as I did in this case, you have to consider how difficult it's going to be to set the position of the slide valve and the eccentrics. And this is far worse. It's a 3.5-inch gauge Ginty chassis, so all the parts are much smaller. And it doesn't work, something is locking up. I never really investigated this too closely because it was something that I didn't want to have a go at. Unfortunately, 3.5-inch gauge models are just a little bit on the small side for me. Just look at all those tiny moving parts, all of which need adjustment. And here on the crank axle are all the eccentric sheaves and eccentric straps. To set up Stephenson'S link valve gear you need to know two things. One is that the slide valves move equidistantly over the ports. And the second important thing is that the eccentric sheaves are in the right position to move the valves over the ports. Now let's just think about this. There are 4 eccentric sheaves and 4 eccentric straps. Each of the straps are held together with 2 bolts, so that's a total of 8 bolts to remove. In this example I am assuming that the eccentric sheaves are held to the crank axle using Allen head grub screws. Before you can change the position of the eccentric sheave on the axle, each set of eccentric straps needs separating. That is why when I build and rebuild engines, I always drill a hole in the lower eccentric strap so I can get an Allen key through the hole, which allows for adjustment of the sheaves without having to remove the eccentric straps. Setting the valve timing on a miniature steam locomotive without drilling a hole in the lower eccentric strap would surely push me over the edge, and I would have to spend considerable time wearing a straitjacket in a padded cell in the local asylum. Honestly, it really is that bad. Have a look at all these parts. To make the engine go, you do need to manipulate quite a lot of them, and they must all be in the correct position. It's at times like this when I think, if my hobby was flower arranging, life would be much more simple. When I turn the chassis on its side, there is a bit of a gap between the eccentric straps and the back of the engine. But that's all well and good when it's just a chassis like this, but if the boiler was on it, there would be no room at all to work. Then there's the complexity at the other end. This is the front of the engine, showing the expansion links and the steam chest cover. Even removing the steam chest cover is not going to be easy, the brake gear's in the way, and it's just a pain. Watching this video really does explain why I do not build locomotives from scratch. Really, my lifespan's not long enough. And to be honest, building one of these would push my patience to the limit. Maybe not in 7 1/4 inch gauge, but in 3 1/2 inch gauge, I don't think so. So just to recap, first of all you make sure that the valves move over the ports equidistantly, and these don't. Then you have to remove all of the gunmetal straps around the eccentric sheaves and adjust them individually in both directions so that the slide valves still move equidistantly over the ports. That's why I'm not going to use a locomotive to show how to set up the timing on a locomotive. I'm going to use this. This is my Stuart 5A that I've been tweaking, and while I was making the video yesterday I thought, I've done a lot of this. It may be a good way of showing the people who are asking about steam locomotive settings how to set up the eccentrics, because basically this engine is the same as a steam locomotive, except it's vertical instead of horizontal, and it has one cylinder instead of two. And furthermore, because it's so big, I won't be obscuring what I'm doing with my large hands when attempting to work on the inside of the frames on a 5 inch gauge or a 3 1/2 inch gauge steam locomotive. When setting the valve gear on a model steam locomotive for the first time, it's a good idea to do it individually. Apply the compressed air to one cylinder at a time, and I've shown this in quite a few videos. That's it for now. I would just like to thank viewers for their response to my previous video about my prostate issues. The results were very interesting. It's not something you think about when you're young, but it's something that you do need to give attention to as you get older, believe me. That's it for now. I'd like to say, as I always do, stay safe, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my main Steam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.